July 1959. It is a warm afternoon in the hills above Los Angeles, and inside the control room of an experimental reactor, a man is watching a single needle climb. The reactor is called the Sodium Reactor Experiment, and it sits on a dusty plateau in the Simi Hills, 30 miles northwest of downtown LA. This is supposed to be a routine power run. The operator glances at a temperature gauge tied to the reactor core. The needle is creeping up. It should be steady. He taps the glass the way you tap any instrument you do not trust. The needle does not drop back. That small upward drift is the first sign that the liquid sodium meant to carry heat safely out of the core has started to fail. Nobody in that room can see what is happening inside the reactor. They are reading the only thing they have, which is numbers on a panel, and the numbers are wrong in a quiet way that does not look like an emergency yet. Over the days that follow, that creeping temperature will become a partial meltdown of the fuel, and the company running this reactor, along with the government that licensed it, will tell the people of Los Angeles almost nothing about it for the next 20 years. The danger that summer was never an enemy or an act of God. The danger was a company and a government that built an experimental reactor with no containment dome in the hills above millions of people, kept running it as the warnings stacked up, let the fuel partially melt, and then decided the public did not need to know. This is the nuclear meltdown they hid from Los Angeles. So what was a sodium-cooled reactor doing in the hills above one of the largest cities in America? In the mid-1950s, the Atomic Energy Commission wanted to prove that nuclear power could run a city, and it chose several experimental reactor designs to test the idea. One of them was the Sodium Reactor Experiment, built and operated by Atomics International, a division of North American Aviation, the same aerospace giant that built fighter jets and rocket engines. The site was the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, a sprawl of roughly 2,600 acres of rock and chaparral on a ridge between Simi Valley and the San Fernando Valley. In 1957, this reactor became one of the first in the United States to send commercial electricity to a public power grid. The nearby town of Moorpark got some of its lights from a reactor in the hills. The cooling was the clever, dangerous part. Instead of water, the reactor used liquid metal, molten sodium pumped through the core to carry heat away. Sodium has a strange appeal to a reactor designer. It stays liquid across a huge range of temperatures. It carries heat far better than water, and it does not need to be kept under crushing pressure the way a water-cooled core does. On paper, a sodium-cooled reactor could run hot and efficient and feed a city. In practice, the metal that made it efficient was also trying to kill the people running it. Liquid sodium burns on contact with air and explodes on contact with water, which is why the whole circuit had to be sealed away from both. To keep the pumps moving that molten metal without seizing, the engineers ran an oil-like fluid called tetralin through the seal and cooling system around the pump. That was the design, and that was the flaw. A reactor cooled by burning metal with a fragile oil circuit threaded right up against the coolant that kept the core alive. The tetralin and the sodium were never supposed to meet. They were separated by seals, and seals wear. There was no concrete containment dome over the building. Reactors built later would be wrapped in a sealed shell designed to trap radiation if the core failed. This one sat in an ordinary industrial building on a hilltop, open to the air it shared with the valleys below. The warnings did not arrive all at once. They arrived as bad readings, the kind the audience for these stories knows by heart. Almost every nuclear accident has a moment where someone looks at an instrument going crazy and decides the instrument must be broken. The sodium reactor experiment had that moment stretched across days. Earlier in 1959, operators had already wrestled with the reactor behaving strangely during power runs, with temperatures and power levels that would not stay where they belonged. The tetralin in the seal system was leaking. It was seeping past a pump seal and into the molten sodium itself, where the intense heat broke it down into a sludge of carbon. That sludge began coating and clogging the narrow channels the sodium needed to flow through to cool the fuel. You can read the failure in the way the runs went. The reactor was taken up to power, and the numbers misbehaved. The power level would not hold steady. Temperatures in parts of the core ran hotter than they should. A reactor that is cooling properly is boring to watch because the readings sit where you put them. This one would not sit still. Each time, instead of tearing the core apart to find out why, the operators worked the problem from the control room and brought the reactor back up for another run. The damaging power runs are believed to have happened across roughly 2 weeks, from the 12th of July to the 26th, a stretch of repeated attempts to keep an experimental reactor on schedule while its cooling quietly choked. The instruments were not broken. They were telling the truth. The cooling was choking, and the men reading the gauges kept the reactor running through power run after power run. Anyway, chasing the schedule, trusting that the strange numbers would settle. They did not settle. Now, walk through what that meant inside the core. The reactor held 43 fuel elements, long assemblies of uranium that produced the heat. They depended completely on the sodium washing past them to stay cool. As the clogged channels starved more and more of them, The fuel had nowhere to send its heat. Temperatures climbed past safe limits. The metal cladding sealing the uranium began to soften and melt. By the time the damage was understood, 13 of the 43 fuel elements had overheated and been damaged, with the cladding partly melted on the worst of them. That is not a small fraction. That is roughly a third of the reactor core ruined by overheating, inside a building with no containment, in the hills above a city of millions. 13 of 43, a partial meltdown. When fuel cladding melts, it releases radioactive gases that had been trapped inside the fuel. Those gases had to go somewhere, and inside a reactor with no dome to hold them. The somewhere was a set of hold-up tanks, and then eventually the open air. The radioactive gas was collected and held, and then, over a period of weeks, it was vented out through a stack into the sky above the Simi Hills. The operators called it controlled venting, done with the approval and oversight of the Atomic Energy Commission, and by the standards written into the rules of 1959, they said it was within limits. If you are still with me, sit with that picture for a moment. A damaged reactor core, venting radioactive gas into the air over Los Angeles for weeks, while the families in Simi Valley and the West Valley went to work and hung their laundry and put their kids to bed, knowing nothing, because here is what those families were told. About 5 weeks after the worst of it, a short press release went out. A local paper, the Van Nuys News, ran the official line in August 1959. The wording was almost soothing. It admitted a fuel element had been damaged, and then it said in plain print that the damage was not a sign of unsafe conditions, and that no release of radioactive materials to the plant or its surroundings had occurred. A reactor core had partially melted in the hills above the city. Radioactive gas was being vented through a stack, and the public statement said no release had happened. Notice the craft in that. It was not a flat lie that could be caught in a single sentence. It admitted just enough, one damaged fuel element, to look like candor, and then it buried the meltdown under careful, technical-sounding reassurance. There was no press conference, no map of where the gas had gone, no warning to the towns downwind. The institutions never said the words partial meltdown, because those words would have brought reporters up the hill. They chose the version of the truth that kept the public calm and kept the program running. That was the whole story as far as Los Angeles knew for 2 decades. The truth surfaced almost by accident, and it took an outside disaster to shake it loose. In 1979, the meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania put nuclear safety on every front page in the country. The fear of that accident sent a group of students and a researcher named Daniel Hirsch at the University of California, Los Angeles, digging into old reactor records. What they pulled out of the archives stopped them cold. The documents and the film footage showed that the fuel at the sodium reactor experiment had not simply cracked or parted, the gentle words the operators had used. It had partially melted, and the records showed the site had been venting radioactive gas into the environment for weeks after the accident, the exact thing the public had been told never happened. They handed the documents to local media, and the story finally broke 20 years late. This is the part where these stories usually give you one name to grieve, and the Santa Susana accident does not offer a single body at the silo door. Nobody dropped dead in that control room in July 1959. The cost here is quieter and slower, and it is carried by 2 groups of people. First, the workers, the operators who stood at those panels reading instruments that were telling the truth, who kept the reactor running on degraded cooling because that was the job and the schedule said so, and who breathed the same hilltop air the gas was vented into. Second, the families downwind, the people of Simi Valley and the San Fernando Valley who lived their ordinary lives below a reactor that had partially melted, and who learned what had happened over their heads only when a UCLA researcher pried it loose 2 decades later. For years afterward, community groups and parents living near the site argued that cancer rates downwind were higher than they should be, and that the contamination from Santa Susana was the reason. Those claims drove lawsuits and studies, and a long fight that still has not fully ended. It is important to be fair here. A direct, proven causal line from this one accident to specific cancers in specific families has never been firmly established, and it remains disputed. What is not disputed is that the people who lived below that hill were never given the chance to know, to ask, or to choose. So how much radiation actually came out of that reactor? This is where the honest answer is that we do not fully know, and the people who have studied it do not agree. The official position, repeated by the Department of Energy and by independent reviews it commissioned, is that only very limited quantities of noble gases escaped, that monitoring found no measurable iodine-131, and that the releases were below the legal limits of the time. On the other side, an expert named Arjun Makhijani, working for plaintiffs in litigation over the site, estimated the accident may have released far more radioactive iodine than the official figures, by his calculation possibly hundreds of times the iodine released at 3 Mile Island. Other analysts landed in between, suggesting a meaningful fraction of the worst radionuclides may have gotten out. These figures are genuinely contested, and the reason they are contested is itself damning. The data from 1959 was scattered, incomplete, and never gathered to answer the question honestly. You cannot measure what you chose not to record. What is not in dispute is the shape of the failure. A company and a government ran an experimental reactor with no containment dome in the hills above millions of people. The cooling system had a known weak point in the tetralin seals. The instruments warned, run after run, that the fuel was overheating, and the reactor kept running. The core partially melted, and then the institutions that were supposed to protect the public told that public almost. Nothing for 20 years. That was not bad luck, and it was not an unforeseeable act of nature. It was a series of choices made by people who decided the schedule and the reputation mattered more than the families breathing the air below. The hill is still there, and it is still being fought over. The Santa Susana Field Laboratory sits on its plateau in the Simi Hills, roughly 2,600 acres of contaminated rock and brush that has been studied, litigated, and promised clean for decades. State and federal agencies have been investigating and arguing over how to remediate the soil since the 1990s. The state's own environmental estimate puts a full soil cleanup another 15 years out from now, which means a reactor that melted in 1959 will not see its ground made clean until well past its 100th anniversary, if the schedule holds at all. In November 2018, the Woolsey fire broke out in the area of the site and burned across roughly 80% of it. Flames swept the contaminated hilltop and sent smoke and ash rolling down into the same valleys that sit downwind, reigniting the old fear that the burning ground was carrying contamination with it. A later study found that the fire's ash did spread radioactive microparticles tied to the site, though it concluded the spread was confined to the areas closest to the lab. A reactor partially melted on that hilltop in 1959, and more than 60 years later, the place still has not been made clean. It has caught fire, and people still argue about what came down on them. And that is the haunting part. Somewhere in the San Fernando Valley and out in Simi Valley, there are people now in their 70s and 80s who grew up in the houses below that ridge, who played in those yards and drank that water and never once heard, while it mattered, that a reactor had melted in the hills above their childhoods. Some of them lived their whole lives never knowing what had happened over their heads on a warm afternoon in July 1959. If you made it this far, thank you for being here. These stories take a long time to research and put together, and every like, comment, and subscription genuinely helps keep the channel going. If you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.